Hello friends! For today's video, I wanted to go through some of the books that I got around to in the month of January. If you hear some grumbling, it's because I'm sure you just saw Luna's around. The cutest dog ever. I love her so much, and I talk about how cute she is basically every day. My husband and I are always like, look at how cute she is. And we're like, we both know because... Anyway, I'm going to stop talking about my dog. Because this is the first wrap-up of the year, I do want to go through some information about how I'm going to be going about wrap-ups and new releases wrap-ups, those sorts of things. I know that you probably just want to skip ahead to the thoughts on books, but I do want to make this information available so that you have it and that you'll know what to look for and where things are going to be. So I'll try to get through this very quickly. I want to start by saying I'm going to still reserve my thoughts for new fantasy and then occasionally sci-fi, occasionally maybe fantasy horror. I'm going to reserve my thoughts on the new releases, specifically to new releases wrap-ups. Within regular wrap-ups, like the one that I'm doing right now, I will mention which books I have read that are new, and then that way you know that those are going to be in upcoming new fantasy releases wrap-ups. They just won't be discussed in depth or anything like that here. They're just going to be mentioned. And then on the topic of new fantasy releases wrap-ups, I am going to allow myself to talk about some that were released in 2023, just because we're still very much in the beginning of 2024, and also because some of the new releases I've been waiting for a really long time for holds to come in at the library, those sorts of things. And so for the first quarter of this year, so through March, in the new fantasy wrap-ups, I'm going to have a combination of both things I have picked up in 2024 that came out in 2024, as well as things that have come out in 2023. But once we get around to April, I'm just going to be talking about new fantasy that's released this year. So I just wanted to give that heads up so that you're like, wait a second, that didn't come out this year. It's still early in this year, so I thought it would be fitting to do it this way. As far as how I'm going to structure regular wrap-ups, what I'm going to do is at the beginning of every wrap-up, so what you'll see, and I'll model this in today's, I'm going to go through and give you an overview of what's going to be discussed today, what new releases I read, so that you know what to look out for in upcoming new releases wrap-ups, and then at the end, I'll let you know of some books that were on a TBR, and if I'm planning on reading them at the very end of whatever month I'm currently filming in, or if they got pushed back and for what reason. So that way, if there was something you were looking forward to hearing thoughts on, then you know, oh, okay, that's still going to be read, or that's currently probably read within the month. It's just the video is being recorded ahead of time, that sort of thing. So to model this, what I'm going to be discussing today, we have A Little Hatred, Rise of the Ranger, Evershore, How to Sell a Haunted House, and Network Effect. The new releases that I've picked up would be Ruthless Vows, The Will of the Many, The Unmaking of June Farrow, Starling House, Map of the Otherlands, and System Collapse. So all those new ones I just mentioned, you'll see those in upcoming new releases wrap-ups. And then for the ones that were on my January TBR that I haven't either gotten around to yet because the month's actually not over, or ones that have been pushed back, we have Addie LaRue. This one's being pushed back because my friend Jade and my friend Christy, whose channels I'll have linked, we all want to read this. And so Jade had messaged me and said, oh, I saw this was on your TBR. Do you think we could buddy read it sometime? And I was like, that sounds fun. And then I saw Christy on her channel talked about how she really wants to read Addie LaRue. It's one of those standalones that she really wants to try and get around to this year. And so I figured, hey, why don't we read this together? So that's been pushed back. We are planning on maybe doing a sprint over on World Hoppers where we are all picking it up, but I haven't read it just yet because I'm waiting to read it with my friends. And then Guards, and Gideon the Ninth. I know so many of you have been waiting, and at the time I'm filming this, there's still a good amount of January left. I just always record videos in advance. So I am going to be reading these at the very end of this month, and you will probably be seeing my thoughts on these in the February wrap-up that I do. And then Defiant, I just didn't get around to this one. Still plan to when I can. I just haven't picked it up just yet. All that said, finally jumping into the wrap-up itself. Because it was a library book and I had to return it, I don't have Rise of the Ranger, but I do have its sequel, so I'm going to hold this up. I'll pop up on the screen, though, a picture of the cover of Rise of the Ranger, so you'll know what to look for if it does sound interesting and you want to give it a try. So this is actually a self-pub fantasy series, and Rise of the Ranger is the first in the series. I believe it's 7 or 8 books long, so it's quite a long series, and I can completely understand why, because the first book was very introductory. That's not to say that it wasn't interesting or that there weren't exciting things happening. It's just that we had so many perspectives and so much to put there in the foundation of this story that I completely get why we would then want to build from that. And we have such an epic scope that we have to have everything settled. And then I think each book is just going to finally hit that. It's going to go up to that peak, that exciting final conclusion. So the first book we follow as sort of your main character, Asher. In the opening of the story, you see there's this elven kingdom and it's under attack. Asher is a young boy, and this elven woman gives him this item and tells him, do not let anybody get their hands on this. And as he is escaping, something occurs, something very strange happens, and then all of a sudden he finds himself somewhere else. And it would seem that the place he was just in, that it is ruins and has been for years. And it's almost like a petrified forest where it's sort of held in a certain time, but you can't really go to it. So I immediately was intrigued. I really was curious about what was going to happen. And I can be kind of picky with fantasy stories that do have so much tied to your almost stereotypical fantasy races and character types, because you do see there are elves, there are dwarves, there are dragons, there are magic users, there are mermaids, basically. I mean, any kind of fantasy race you can think of, it felt like all of them were here, and they weren't necessarily straying away too much from what we typically think of elves. For example, the elves in this story, they live really long lives, they kind of have their noses up at humans, they're all very beautiful, the typical type of things you see. However, the story itself had so much intrigue, and I do feel like the characters had a lot of character to them, that I did not feel like it was too redundant. It was too familiar. It felt like we were building from something familiar, and we were building our own unique story from these classic fantasy tropes, you could say. So Asher being somewhat of our main character, you kind of see him, something has transpired in his life where you saw him at the beginning to where he is for the rest of the story. He's a grown man. He is, and when I say grown man, I mean he's not like 20 years old. I know for a lot of us, we actually are kind of excited when we find out that a fantasy story has an adult in it. I'm not trying to dismiss if you're 20. I'm not trying to say you're not an adult. But I mean, sometimes it's nice to see a character where you're like, you've been through some stuff. And this character has been through some stuff. And what's transpired in his life between that opening and where he is in present day, I was so fascinated by. I wanted to pick this character apart. I wanted to know more about them. And you slowly start to unveil their story, but you unveil it through their interactions with other people, what little bits Asher reveals to them. And also other people have a very specific view of the group that trained Asher. He has a reputation. So I really like that you learn about him from his own perspective as well as through all these other characters. And the other characters themselves, they range from being the knight, the elf, the magic school kid who's really brilliant but maybe gets into trouble. So you have all these other people, and at first they are not connected. And you're slowly starting to see how all of their plot lines come together. You might be asking, so what is the antagonist, or what is the antagonistic force in this story? I think with epic fantasy, there's not always a set goal of this is the bad guy, this is the person that we have to take down, but it is very much rooted in that item that Asher is still somewhat in possession of, and the people who maybe want that item for their own personal gain, because they want power, because they want to restore power to their race. So you start to see all these characters, and you're starting to see slowly, like, I think that this is going to be the big bad of the series, or I think this might be an adversary, or I think maybe this is an adversary for this book, but I don't know if they're going to be for the rest of the series. And in general, I just thought, as far as epic fantasy, I thought it was done really well. I do think, though, for myself personally, I think this will be a shared feeling for a lot of other people. Because this first one is so introductory, and because you have so many perspectives, you just have to buckle in. If you're going to start this one, you probably have to give it some time, because for a while you're going to be like, another new character, and you might even think like, when are we getting back to Asher? Because I mean, Asher was my man. I wanted to always come back to him. It's I don't know what to say. It's one of those things where you're like, is it that I love this character, or is it that it was the first person I saw? And I think it's a combination of both. But regardless, you're really going to have to prepare for it to take a while. And I did do a video talking about stories that are like that, And if you are the kind of person that you actually like that sort of slow build, I'll have that video linked so you can check out other stories that fall into that camp. But if you like epic fantasy, if you like some of those classic fantasy tropes where we're doing something different with the plot, then I would definitely recommend checking this one out. I do plan to immediately jump into this second book because I don't want to forget a lot of the things that we saw. Also, there's dragons. And I feel like that's always a plus. Next up, we have Evershore, which is a part of the Skyward series. If you're unsure where it fits, you have the first 2 books in the Skyward series, and then you have, I believe, the next 2 are novellas. Then you get the 3rd book. Then you get Evershore, which is a part of the bind-up of the novellas. Then you get Defiant. So when I was saying I really wanted to make sure I read Evershore before jumping into Defiant, that's why, because it's not going to fit after Defiant. There's some pretty important things that happen in Evershore. You actually see a hint of what you're going to get with this plot line. You kind of get a hint of it at the end of Cytonic as well as at the end of the other novellas. And I was really scared for this character. I was really worried about them because I was thinking, oh my gosh, they just had something really awful and really traumatic happen. And I do like that we got to examine the character's initial reaction to this traumatic event, which I don't want to say because I don't want to reveal if you haven't read it. You're just examining how they're processing that while still trying to be a good leader to his flight crew. And often the way you can just so easily dive into whatever your job is, whatever your obligations are, you can really utilize that instead of actually looking at your grief. You're starting to see that that's really what they're leaning into, and I thought that was very realistic. I do wish that we had found a way to incorporate some of these parts of the story within Cytonic. I know that would have made Cytonic a lot longer, and it would have gone from being a single POV to a multiple POV story, and I know some people don't like going from single to multi, but I think I would have preferred that. I found Cytonic to be I don't think Cytonic was bad by any means, but I actually think it could have been enhanced by seeing what some of the other crew members were experiencing, and I think Evershore is not excluded from that. I wish Evershore was placed, because it is kind of simultaneously happening somewhat with the events of Cytonic, certainly before Defiant. I think it was a little longer than I was expecting. I almost wish it had been... It's not that I wish it would have been trimmed, I just don't know that I needed it to be entirely a separate story. Still good, still I think worth reading between Cytonic and Defiant, and definitely I think examines that initial shock of grief in a very realistic way in which we grapple with grief. I thought it did that very well. Next up, we have Network Effect. I have to say, before I ever checked out Murderbot, I had always heard people say the novellas are fantastic. The full-length novel, pacing's not as good, and maybe it's not really the forte within this series, but, you know, it's still important to read. I think this was my favorite in the Murderbot series, and I've already been enjoying Murderbot, but this one I actually liked being able to spend more time with Murderbot and gang, and there was a few things I loved about this one. First, you actually see Murderbot trying to figure out how to navigate friendship, because Murderbot is sort of programmed to protect their humans, and they're realizing that they might actually somewhat care a little bit more than just protecting them because it's their programming, that they might actually dislike some of them, like some of them, find them tedious, find them annoying. You know, there's all these very human emotions that come with interacting with people, and Murderbot just sort of discovering themselves, you could say. So I have enjoyed that throughout the series. But there is a different dynamic when Murderbot becomes friends, what I view as friendship. When Murderbot becomes friends with another machine, AI, that sort of thing, it's a different dynamic. It's like a dog discovering another dog, and you're like, no, even though I know my dog loves me, you know, it's cute when they love another dog, or something like that. So you see a lot of that in this, but you also see all of the petty arguments and Murderbot not quite knowing how to deal with the fact that they have feelings for this other being, and also the humans around Murderbot don't quite know how to dissect what are clearly feelings toward this other thing. And I say feelings because the humans are like, is this almost like a a machine romance? Is this a machine friendship? And Murderbot's like, it's none of those things. It's, and they just get so flustered and overwhelmed, and it's precious, and it's funny. And their arguments with this other, I'm going to say AI, with this other AI are so dumb and so petty and kind of realistic. And what makes this, in my opinion, work really well beyond just it's a new part of Murderbot discovering more about themselves is the fact that it so well parallels their relationship, their experience with one of the humans within this specific entry to the Murderbot diaries, because they are dealing with somebody who is much younger. They're kind of an adolescent. And Murderbot is constantly thinking, the teenage ones or the adolescent ones, they always are more prone to fill in the blank stereotype about young people, right? And Murderbot, I think, is representing that themselves. They don't know how to navigate friendships. They have really dramatic reactions to things. They can throw tantrums, essentially, just like this other person that they're kind of like, oh, geez. And I loved the lack of awareness that that's what they were behaving like, while of course there still being an important plot, and the AI also cares about its humans, and so they're trying to help it with certain things involving that. And I also really liked the commentary on the way in which there are so many people that can get lost within the system, because the system, there's just too much paperwork, too many people that are trying to make a profit, there's too many, but with this policy and then this, and there's all this arguing, and then it results in some people just being left behind, falling through the cracks, except for because it's sci-fi and it's on a huge scale, it's like a planetary level of people being left behind. And I really enjoyed that commentary, so I think this was my favorite in the series so far. I really enjoyed picking this one up. I really enjoyed revisiting some of the individuals that we've seen in the past, and then just in general, I love seeing more of Murderbot's growth. I don't know how much I need to say about this next one because I already said so much in a dedicated review, and that would be How to Sell a Haunted House by Grady Hendrix. I do want to make very clear, because I know some people click off of videos or maybe they don't have a chance to finish the video. I do say at the end of my review that I think everything Grady Hendrix did in this book was intentional. And the reason I'm emphasizing that is because this book is ridiculous. It is so over the top, just chaotic. And it was entertaining, but also there were a lot of moments where I'm like, what are we doing? What are we doing? And I was honestly baffled by how bizarre and sometimes how stupid the characters behaved, how stupid they talked, how their decision-making process was just non-existent sometimes, or the decision would be made, but you're like, that's a decision you're making? And it was an experience, to say the least, but I do think it was all intentional, as I think Grady Hendrix, and this is what I've heard also from other people about his other works, is utilizing what you see in the horror genre, but then also mocking it, being somewhat satirical with it, and criticizing it by representing how ridiculous and over the top it can be. But what made this a really odd reading experience is the first half of this story, or maybe a little less, maybe like first 35-40%, was pretty grounded, it was pretty realistic, and it was touching on some pretty serious topics. So when it went into the next lane and became pure stupid chaos, I was taken aback. And I was like, what are we doing now? What is this? Where are we going with this? And the setup for the story is you have these two siblings whose parents have tragically passed away. These siblings are adults. They're now having to deal with having to sell their parents' house, trying to figure out what to do with the possessions, the funeral. Are they going to cremate? Are they going to bury? What are they going to do for the service? All the things that come when individuals in your life have passed away. So they're now having to deal with that while also dealing with their grief and the fact that they do not get along. These siblings are polar opposites, and our main character, she can't stand her brother. She thinks he's a loser. He seems to have this idea that she's stuck up and she always thought she was better than them. So you're just exploring these family dynamics and also exploring grief. And then it gets really silly And it is, like I said, it is entertaining, and I think it was intentional. It's just, I've not come across this balance of silly and serious. I think I have seen stories before that are over-the-top satire, and within them there is something serious, and there's, like, great commentary. But overall, it's very clear the entire time, hey, we're mocking this, we're pointing out, we're criticizing, but we're also utilizing. And then there's the other parts that are just like, no, this is just a horror story, and let me try to have these compelling characters and this realistic portrayal of grief and familial drama. And for it to sit like in this weird in-between, especially when it's not a blend throughout, it's just all of a sudden you hit a wall and you're like, oh, now we're the other, you flip a switch, now you're the other thing. That's where it really became odd for me. However, I still think that, especially if you're a horror fan, that maybe it would be interesting to see the way in which Grady Hendrix uses and dismantles some of what we've seen before. And I think it also is pretty funny. It's not a haunted house story, though. That's what I want to also mention. If you're really into atmospheric house or building, like something seems wrong with this place, it's not really what you're going to get. I don't want to say too much more because I don't want to give that away, but I don't also want people to be disappointed. So just know you're not actually getting a haunted house story. And I'll leave it at that. And then last we have A Little Hatred. I will have a whole dedicated video sort of looking back at the previous works in this world, as well as reading through this first book in this new series, because I had so many feelings and thoughts, and I don't think there's going to be anything that's going to top this book this year. And it's kind of a blessing and a curse, because on one hand, it's always so great when you find something where like, that was amazing, but at the same time, you're like, everything else is going to suck compared to this. And I actually messaged Leanna, my friend, and I was like, I feel bad for all the books I read after this, because they're just not going to be as good. And she's like, except for the second one, and except for the third one. And I was like, way to make this a positive. I'm just so excited, because I'm like, that's true. I get to read more in this series. But I loved A Little Hatred. I think everything that a lot of us like about Joe Abercrombie's writing, his humor, the way in which he depicts how human beings truly are, us at our worst, us just raw, all of those things I think were not just improved upon, I think that they are some of the best in all of fantasy. I loved this, and I think some of the criticisms toward Abercrombie about there not being even somewhat of a plot or a cohesive plot, or okay, there's a plot, but you kind of have to read the whole series before you really see it. I think that was very much remedied. Still, I think very character focused, but the character, it's like all the good things were still there, and the typical criticisms, I honestly think you could pretty much just erase. I mean, he somehow managed to accomplish all of it, and I think it's a really difficult thing to do. I found my feelings for the characters, I was frustrated with them. I was amused by them. There's one character that I hated the first chunk of the book, and then I'm like, I know, he's gonna make me like this stupid character. I bet he's gonna make me like this dumb character. And then he did, and I'm like, gosh darn it, why? But this guy sucks. And then he did his usual thing where you're like, oh, well, now they're kind of like funny, or like now I feel kind of bad. But also they still suck, but they're entertaining to read from. It's that way in which we're constantly having a battle within ourselves about Glocta. I think a lot of us are like, but Glocta is not necessarily a good person, but he's funny. It's that sort of feeling. So there's definitely that. I think one of the other criticisms a lot of people have about First Law is we're pretty exclusively looking at and dissecting the male characters. You do have some female characters, but they did fall into some stereotypes that you tend to see within fantasy. And it's not that those characters weren't still interesting. They just weren't as fleshed out as their male counterparts. And in this series, the way that the women were written was fantastic. I think this is not a world at all where sexism doesn't exist, because it just wouldn't be... I mean, sexism is a real thing, and Abercrombie is incorporating so much realism into his work and how the women react to this. And there's different female characters, too, and how they push back against things, how they use things to their advantage. I just thought that was really well done also. So again, I mean, just whatever criticisms, the main criticisms that a lot of people have for First Law, it's just like, the series is, I already really like First Law, so then it's just such a step above, which is really exciting. But I also, on one hand, feel almost arrogant saying that, because it just feels like I'm over here on my chair looking down like, you've done much better this time, which hopefully you know what I mean. I already liked it. I already thought it was great. There's a reason that I think Abercrombie is sort of a staple in fantasy. And then now it's like, oh my gosh, this is even better? It's exciting. It's not trying to dismiss all the work that he's put into his previous books. As for the plot, for those of you that don't know, you're looking at a sort of turn of the century. Technology has really risen to be such an integral part of society, but as a result of people just wanting to profit, just trying to make money, you are now seeing a lot of individuals who are mistreated, who have horrible work conditions. You're having deaths that nobody is compensated, whether it be a family member or whoever was like a dependent from that person. You just have these horrible circumstances, and nobody at the top is doing anything. So these people here at the bottom are starting to get riled up, and you can see the direction it's likely going to go. I will say, it moved so much faster than I was expecting. You do have a lot of characters to get introduced to for the beginning, and thankfully, because Abercrombie is so good at having your characters feel really distinct, there really wasn't for me an issue of like, who's this again? It was very clear who was who. And it didn't feel like they were caricatures. He somehow just manages to capture people as they are and how distinct people can be from one person to the next. But point is, it takes a while before you really see everybody, but once the pieces are there and as the pieces are being introduced to you, you're like, oh no, I know where this is going. And then even though you have an idea plot-wise of how things are going to go downhill, it's still not quite to the extent I imagined it would be. I didn't know how our characters were going to get through things, how they were going to process things, if they were going to even reach the other side of things. I just didn't know how things were going to play out, even though I had an idea of the direction they were going to go in. So it was kind of it was really satisfying and a great reading experience, because you're like on your toes, but you also just have this looming dread the whole time also. And then on top of all of that, there is a part of you that's like, some of these people maybe, it's not that I want them to deserve what really violent things occur. It's not like I'm like, they deserve that. But you're like, you're not good. And things do need to change. So, but often change is messy and bloody and extremely violent. And does anything really change when violence does occur? And is there somebody always actually behind the scenes trying to profit from chaos, and just all these great elements all poured into one book? So I loved it. I loved it so much. I can't wait to read books 2 and 3. And I am both happy and sad, because I don't know that there will be too many things this year that come close. I think it was fantastic. I'm so glad I finally read it. I'm sad it took me so long to read it, but it was great. And if you do want to see more in-depth thoughts, even though I just talked so much about it, be on the lookout for that Abercrombie vlog. But anyway, that's it for some of the books that I got around to in January. I already discussed at the beginning how we're going to play through the new releases and such things, so be on the lookout for those. There are some new releases from last year that I didn't read this month, but that will also be showing up in New Fantasy Releases Wrap-Up, so it might be a little bit before some of the ones I mentioned get talked about, but they will be talked about, I promise. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.